Good morning, everyone. In the previous lessons, we looked at why Elizabeth could not ignore Philip. Then we saw why Philip could not ignore Elizabeth. And now we're simply asking ourselves, why can we not ignore them and their relationship? Now, why is the defeat of the Spanish Armada a significant event in world history? Significance is always kind of tricky for a historian, also because pretty much everything is significant. I've met people who made a history of the fountains in eastern Anatolia, and it turned out to be a pretty significant series of development. So everything, if you spin it hard enough, can become a historically significant subject in one way or another. However, some events are more significant than others. And to keep in the metaphor, the World War II was more significant than the development of fountains in Anatolian Kurdistan. Now, in this lesson, we will try to see why the fact that the Spanish fleet that was led by the Duke of Medina Sidonia was unable to launch an invasion of England, and why this was a hugely significant event. In doing so, we will be looking at three main points. How the defeat of the Spanish Armada. We will not go into detail about how the Armada was defeated. This will be kind of a given. It's an interesting series of events and a masterpiece in tactical and strategic misplanning, lack of planning and lack of ability to execute a plan, and also a good example of the English ability to deal with naval warfare. But we'll not deal with that. Today we'll look at the significance of this event. We will look at the short-term consequences, so how it confirmed Elizabeth's success as a ruler. We will see how it marked an end to the Spanish ambitions in the region, so we'll look at the medium-term consequences. And finally, we will see how this event, the Spanish defeat, was the beginning of English naval supremacy in the oceans of the world, so the long-term consequences. Of course, to fully understand what we're talking about, you will need to have listened to the previous lessons, but here is a quick rundown of the situation. Philip II needs England for his European strategy aimed at destroying the power of its arch-enemy France. Then his strategy goes out of the window after his wife/cousin Mary, also known as Bloody Mary, dies in 1558, and his Protestant half-sister Elizabeth is crowned Queen of England and refuses to help him. Then, meanwhile, the Dutch decided to start a horrendously huge and complicated and fascinating uprising against the Spanish rule in the Netherlands, and despite all odds they are able to resist, mainly because instead of fighting in the open, they locked themselves in the new impenetrable fortresses, built with the money of the Spanish themselves, and flooded absolutely everything as soon as an enemy army approached. The Dutch also happen to be Protestant, which for Elizabeth is great because she can now use this religious solidarity to send them supplies, give them support, and finally eventually send troops to their aid. Meanwhile, again, there are a lot of meanwhiles in history. Meanwhile, the English privateers and the Spanish Navy are fighting an undeclared war in the Atlantic Ocean, which is costing Spain millions of gold coins. Then, seeing that A, Elizabeth is Protestant, B, she is helping his enemies in the Netherlands, and C, she is stealing his gold, Philip II decided to put together a fleet and show her who's boss. Due to the audacity of some English commander, the logistical nightmare of picking up and disembarking troops across the Channel, and the usual terrible English weather, the Armada eventually failed in its mission. The ships were scattered, and England lived happily ever after, until the Civil War, at least 60 years later. So, these were more or less the causes, those were the events so far. But why are we talking about this event 450 years after it happened? Of course, it was supposed to be in the exam, is a good point, but also because this event had changed the history of the world. We cannot know what would have happened if Spain had actually landed on English soil in 1588, but we can assume that Elizabeth's religious policy would have changed if Elizabeth survived, and that England's independence would have been very seriously limited during a crucial period in its history in which it was turning from a second-rate European power which no one really considered to be that important into a proper global power and eventually into the world's largest empire in the 18th and 19th centuries. So let's look at the short-term consequences. The main effect of the defeat of the Armada was confirming to everyone that Elizabeth was not just the legitimate ruler, but also an effective one. Since the excommunication of Elizabeth in 1570, her reign had been constantly threatened by revolts and plots, and we went through that already. The country was politically divided. Think of the religious groups, the court factions, the social divisions between the rich and the poor, and so on. And there were even people who still accused her of being the illegitimate daughter of Henry VIII, even after some 30 years on the throne. These threats were very real for Elizabeth, and we have discussed many of them already in detail. After 1588, however, the number of immediate threats, plots, conspiracies, and revolts, decreased drastically. But sir, I hear you say, what about Essex's rebellion? Well, dear student, Essex's rebellion in 1601 was not against Elizabeth per se, but was a power struggle inside the council. It was not a threat to Elizabeth, but a struggle between two factions to decide which was the most powerful inside the Privy Council. After the failure of the Armada, Elizabeth's legitimacy was very rarely threatened again. She also presented herself as the savior of the country from what was effectively an existential threat. Her approval rating, we would say today, were through the roof. So to conclude this point, no more serious plots, also because American of Scots, the main other claimant to the English throne, was dead. The country became stronger and rallied around a victorious queen who was able to kick the Spanish out, or just not let them in. And finally, Elizabeth saw her legitimacy and her position confirmed. Moving on to the medium-term consequences, we must look at how the global superpower of the 16th century, Spain, the Spanish Habsburg Empire, reacted to this defeat. As we said, Philip II considered England as the key of his European strategy against France, but now he had to change his plans. He was also the main sponsor of the Catholic cause, which did not look as good after his defeat. Finally, arming and crewing 140 warships had been a huge investment in manpower and money which could not be recovered easily. All these factors conspired to effectively nullify the Spanish threat to England in the following decades. Even though Spain actually did try again, it was not as significant or as actually threatening as the first time. And we see a general reduction of the Spanish influence in the Spanish presence in the region, and on the Spanish control of its territories in the Netherlands. Of course, the war against the Dutch would continue for 60 more years until 1648, but Spain was less able, now that the English Channel was more firmly under English control, to send troops and supplies to its army in the Netherlands. We also see that the entire foreign policy of Spain had to change, and again its grasp on the key Dutch provinces, which were wealthy and strategically located, had been made weaker by the English control over the Channel. Finally, the vacuum left by the Spanish retreat in the region allowed England to emerge as an independent actor, not just as a former rebellious Spanish ally as it had been during the reign of Mary and partially during the reign of Henry VIII as well, because we must remember that King Henry VIII went to war against France mostly to help the Spanish Emperor Charles V, the previous generation. The last point I want to talk about is the long-term consequences of the failure of the Armada, the emergence of England as a global naval power. Since the end of the Hundred Years' War, a century prior in 1453, the English crown had realized that the kingdom was now confined into an island and gave up on the ambitions that it had on French soil, despite the wars led by Henry VIII and later by Mary. This was a very important development because you have to remember that the Kingdom of England had always been, since its very inception in 1066, more French than English. Only with the end of the Hundred Years' War the Kingdom of England became England. For most of its history at this point, the Kingdom of England was mostly in France. The wealthiest part of the kingdom were in what is now France. So now the Kingdom of England was just in England. And England is on an island. Now, one of the consequences of this change was, of course, the realization that a fleet was required to defend the country, because now the main body of the country was separated from the rest of Europe by a very narrow strip of salt water. And of course, the fleet was built under the orders of King Henry VIII. While its beginnings were difficult, and look at the story of the Mary Rose for more information about how the early Tudor fleet worked. We got this ship called the Mary Rose, which sank. They were still using longbows in the 1520s. It's actually a very interesting thing because it gives us a window into into Tudor military and naval history, which otherwise we would not have. So while the beginning of the fleet were difficult, it eventually proved up to the task and was soon recognized as one of the strategic assets of the country, the one thing it could not do without. This was to have huge consequences in world history, as we all know. Rule Britannia, Britannia ruled the waves. First of all, England, and later Britain, became more detached from continental politics, and only rarely intervened in continental wars. It was not a complete withdrawal. England would constantly intervene in the major wars, but it was kind of like that friend you have in your group, which is not part of the group of friends, but only joins in every now and then and spends his time doing his own things in another continent. As we said, it was not a complete withdrawal, but simply the realization that colonizing the Americas and taking advantage of oceanic trade tended to be more profitable. And then again, England still participated to most of the major European wars at the time. Eventually, by the 18th century, the English/British navies would become the unchallenged masters of most oceans in the world, a position that they would hold until sort of the mid-20th century. This attention to naval power also helped the construction of one of the largest and most influential colonial empires the world had ever seen, the British Empire. So those were the three main consequences of the failure of the Armada, the three main reasons why 450 years later we are still studying it. First, it made Elizabeth more secure in her position. Okay, it allowed Elizabeth to maintain the throne and keep England stable. Okay, because otherwise it might have fallen into a succession crisis. God knows what could have happened. Two, it put an end to Spanish ambitions in the region. Okay, Spanish withdrew sort of from the region, stopped being as present as it used to be, and now England became a strong independent actor in the area of the English Channel, the Netherlands, and Flanders and Northern Europe. Three, it launched an age of English naval supremacy in the next centuries. As we said, Rule Britannia, Britannia ruled the waves is a 19th century song, but its roots are in the 16th century, in the defeat of the Spanish Armada. Okay, this was it. Those were more or less the facts. I'm looking forward to read what you can write, and see you next time.